Welcome to our book talk this evening. My name is Julian. My pronouns are it or they. I'm currently working with Affirm United, S'affirmer Ensemble on the Reaffirm project. And with me here is Lucas Wilson, editor and composer of the lot of Shame, Sex, Attraction, the book that we are going to be discussing tonight. I want to just turn it over to Lucas to offer us some information about who you are, where you're coming from, what sort of brought you here to being with us.
So born and raised in Toronto. I am the youngest of five children. I come from a big old family. However, despite what a lot of folks think when they read my work or hear about me, I do not come from a religious family. I grew up with a mom who I always say was haunted by her Baptist demons that she grew up with and was raised with. And my dad was, an agnostic, perhaps is the best way we could put that. And so we didn't really have religion in our house too much, other than, my mom taught us how to say our prayers and how to say grace and that kind of thing. And when we were really little, when I was really little, we would go to church. And so there was this one church that we went to. It was Fellowship Evangelical Baptist, which is quite similar to the Southern Baptists in the US. It's a very conservative tradition. And we went to that church on and off for about, for me up until about grade 2 or 3. And after that, every good Canadian family, we just went to the cottage instead. And so we stopped going to church, and that was that. And for me, again, religion didn't really play at all, really any role in my life. Even when we were going to church when I was quite young, we would go to church when we did, on the off chance that we went, and then we'd come home and shut the heck up about it. Like, we never talked about Jesus. We never talked about God. That these were simply just not conversations that we had in our house. And so for me, by the time I was getting into high school, this is where Jesus entered the picture again. And so my brother got really into the creation versus evolution debate, and he, was watching these DVDs from this creationist down in, Pensacola, Florida, and he was like, "Luke, you got to watch these DVDs with me." And I was like, "No chance." It's like, no way. I don't want to do that. And over time, he convinced me to watch these DVDs. Anywho, long story short, I started watching these creationist, and I mean very conservative views and interpretations of scripture. And I started watching these DVDs. And by the end of it, I decided that I, in fact, did believe that there was a creator, some sort of intelligent designer. And as a result, I thought, well, maybe I should go to church. And so I went to the church that I had gone to when I was quite young. And it was from there that, for about 10 years, you didn't see me outside of church on a Sunday morning. You didn't see me out of church on a, Wednesday night for youth group. I was there. I was in it to win it. I was, I guess like a young evangelical zealot, quite conservative, very invested in my faith. And this is, this church and youth group really defined my entire high school years. And when it eventually came time to decide where I wanted to go to university, I, for a long time, thought I was going to go to Briarcrest, which is a small Bible college out in Saskatchewan. That didn't turn out, or pan out, should I say. And so I eventually decided, I might as well just go to the University of Toronto. I live here and, it's a good school. But then I heard about a university down in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's a lot to say about the name Lynchburg, but we'll put a pin in that for now. And I decided I was, and the school's name was Liberty University. As how US can one get, right? So the school was actually founded by, and I always hazard to mention or invoke this man's name, but by Jerry Falwell. And for those who know who Jerry Falwell is, well, I don't have to say much more. For those who don't know who Jerry Falwell is, I always say count your blessings. And so I went to visit this school, and I went down to visit 6 times on a charter bus. I went down and checked out the university and was, and I mean, everything's bigger in the US, right? The university experience, the college experience, as they put it, it's all just sort of, like football, as if, I liked football. But, these were the things that they were doing, and sort of the rah-rah sort of school spirit that you don't see, at least as much, in Canadian universities. And so as a young evangelical, this was super exciting. Like, this was, I thought to myself, not only is there this big university experience, but it's Christian and everything, there, it must be better because it's Christian. In fact, Jerry Falwell had a statement or a saying. He said, if it's Christian, it ought to be better. And I agreed. And so I decided that I wanted to go to the school. Now, part of what was impacting my decision to go there, and perhaps what was impacting my desire to really be in church for a long time more broadly, was the fact that I was hiding I was gay. And when I was in youth group, I think, and in church when I was in high school, I think in a lot of ways, the church offered me, at least in my own estimation, a cover for my sexuality. Because I thought to myself, within that evangelical logic, which is very much a binary understanding of the world, if I'm a Christian, I can't be queer, right? And so I thought, if I go to church, no one will know I'm gay. However, I watched a lot of HGTV growing up. The writing was on the wall, people knew. But I again thought that I was, fooling, other folks. Certainly wasn't fooling myself, but at least fooled my mom. That was important. And so when I went to check out Liberty University, I decided that I wanted to go there in large part because I knew that that school had a conversion therapy program. I've since found out they have multiple and have had multiple conversion therapy programs, and we can talk more about that. But when I was making my decision, I had a little checklist of, going to University of Toronto, it's closer. Going to Liberty, it was actually cheaper to go to Liberty for good reason. But we'll put the quality of my education aside for now. The fact that, it was a Christian university, I thought that was great. So that was a check. The one thing and the only thing that I put two checks for was the fact that they had a conversion therapy program. And of course, I didn't conceptualize it at the time as a conversion therapy program. At the time, I understood it as, there's a pastor there who can counsel me. And they offered what they referred to as biblical counseling or pastoral counseling, right? And this is what conversion therapy does. It obfuscates or masks how it presents itself. Because of course, people know the PR, and the optics of presenting that they had a conversion therapy program. No one wants to claim that. Instead, they use this use of euphemistic language to cover over what they offer. And at the end of the day, whenever you see pastoral counseling or biblical counseling, and it's in regards to gender and sexuality, and it's coming from a conservative evangelical tradition, 9 times out of 10, that they're talking about conversion therapy. Anywho, this is some retrospectives perspective, I guess. And so putting that aside, I went there, and for 4 years, I was a student at Liberty University, and for 4 years, I was in the conversion therapy program. And so I think we're going to talk more about that experience or those experiences tonight. So I'll leave it there, but that gives you a little bit of an idea as to where I come from professionally, and then how that informs my work today. Because today, most of what I work on is the new Christian right or white Christian nationalism, specifically in the US, a little bit in Canada, but mostly in the US, and particularly in regards to conversion practices.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Each time you tell these stories, I find you tell a different joke that makes me laugh. So I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing with us. I'm curious if you can share how these ideas came to you to want to gather these stories and put together a collection.
Well, you know what? If we didn't tell jokes, I think we'd just be crying when we're talking about evangelicalism and conservative traditions, right? So I guess it's a survival mechanism. Anywho, yeah, how I came about gathering these stories. So I actually got a message on the artist formerly known as Twitter, X. Elon Musk has since rebranded. And so I was I was at the doctor's office, and all of a sudden I got this message on Twitter, and it was from this person who presented themselves as an editor saying, "Hey, I work for a press. We've been following your work about conversion therapy. Would you be interested in putting together a collection of stories?" And at first I thought, this is a scam. Like, this isn't real. Like, no one reaches out on social media and has like legitimate offers. It's kind of like when you get an email from someone and it says like, "I'm the prince of, Nigeria, and I have a lot of money for you waiting. If only you give me your credit card information." It's that kind of thing. So I thought to myself, there's no way. And so I quickly Googled this editor at this press. I quickly Googled the press. Sure enough, both are legitimate. This person does work at this press. This press is a reputable press coming out of London, England. And I thought to myself, well, gee whiz, like what an opportunity. And so I messaged back and I said really quickly, yes, and tell me how, what to do and where to sign. And so it was a little bit of back and forth where I spoke with the editor, and we negotiated that we wanted to only include survivors of conversion therapy and their stories. We didn't want any fictional accounts. We didn't want any sort of imaginative representations of what people believed to happen behind closed doors within conversion therapy spaces. Instead, we wanted survivors' accounts. We wanted people who went through these different practices and experiences, and for those stories to be front and center. I think that when we're thinking about representations of conversion therapy these days, there's a lot of good work going on in the academy, right? So a lot of phenomenal studies. There's a lot of nonprofits doing good work. But when we talk about the media, a lot of most recently, I think the biggest splash, sort of representation-wise, of conversion therapy was the documentary on Netflix. And this documentary, it centered the voices of those who were perpetrators within the movement, within the ex-gay movement. And so I thought to myself, we've heard enough from those folks. Instead, let's hear from survivors. And of course, I stand on the shoulders of giants like Garrett Conley and other folks who have written about this the subject. But I thought to myself, this is a great opportunity, not just to, again, center survivors' voices, but also to really represent the diversity of conversion practices. Because I think oftentimes a lot of us have an idea as to what conversion therapy is, right? We think of that crackpot counselor. We think of that, loony pastor and, leading a group in a semicircle in his church basement, or maybe in his living room, this kind of stuff. And we have these ideas. However, conversion therapy is much broader than that. And the practices that fall under the umbrella of conversion therapy are, again, much more varied than what we necessarily think. Right? One can be one's own conversion therapist. Of course, that person is typically, tied up in a religious system that is a high control, conservative tradition. But nonetheless, that person can be, doing these things to themselves, right? They can be practicing conversion therapy themselves. And there is a story in the collection that gives voice to that experience. There are also folks whose parents were their conversion therapists. Those who were supposed to care and nurture for them instead became the people who were their own victimizers. There are more, traditional or stereotypical representations of conversion therapy with, a pastor or with, a counselor, sometimes licensed, sometimes not. It really does depend. But then there are also stories at universities, right? Christian universities or seminaries where there are, professors who are, or paid staff members who are conversion therapists. And so the collection really gives voice to a diversity of experiences. And that was really, I think, the intervention that this collection makes to representations of conversion therapy, which is to show this diversity of, really horrible experiences, but nonetheless, to give voice to those experiences and to center the survivors who underwent these practices.
Yeah, and so on that note, you went through a whole process of collecting stories and speaking with survivors and, being in community with one another. I'm curious if you were surprised by any of the stories or if they perhaps follow patterns that are familiar to you. Maybe a combination of both would be my guess, but I'm curious about that.
When I first went into it, I had, I think, a pretty stereotypical understanding of conversion therapy as well. Granted, I knew that, it didn't matter if it was a pastor at a university, like my experience, or a pastor, at a church, or, a licensed professional who, moonlights as a pastor kind of thing, right? I knew that there was these sorts of, experiences. However, I think that that the collection really showed me the ways that conversion therapy operates in a multiplicity of contexts. I also think that, part of what I was doing, and I think you can take for me, my academic training, of course, really, for those who have read the collection, you see it in the introduction. You see me depart from my academic sort of tone in my story. But for the introduction, it very much reads as, sort of a primer or an overview of conversion therapy. And when I was doing the research, there's a lot of really good research coming out of Australia. And when I was doing the research for the introduction, one of the moves I make in the introduction is to talk about not just conversion therapy, but to broaden what we talk about when we talk about conversion therapy, and to talk about conversion practices. And conversion practices, I say that, not all queer folks have undergone conversion therapy, but all queer folks have undergone conversion practices. Now, what does that mean? Conversion therapy, again, is typically, with a conversion practitioner, someone who you sit with for months, sometimes years. And of course, there's a lot of damaging work that these folks do. And it's very much an intentional thing, right? And again, that conversion practitioner can be yourself, it can be your parents, it can be a pastor, it can be a counselor, it can be whomever. But that's although there is a diversity of experiences within conversion therapy, that's its own sort of world of experiences. Beyond that, conversion practices are really just efforts to align people, whether they be gender or sexual minorities, with the heteronormative model, right? So any young queer person, for me, I very much fit the stereotype of the child, living very comfortably in my sister's closet, figuratively and literally, in some senses. I played with my sister's toys all the time. I got my own doll houses when it was Christmas time, all this kind of stuff, right? I did a lot of what was considered stereotypical feminine behavior as a young boy.
Oh yeah,
Right.
when I was a young kid, I had a mullet and colorful overalls, but somehow it's mystery. So I'm there with you.
We love queer expression at every age. And I think that for me, thank goodness I had parents who didn't give two hoots. Again, because they weren't really, really religious. It didn't, and again, my dad was not religious. My dad was sort of this hippity dippity, he wrote a book on Bob Dylan, had a record store and had a music studio in her basement. He was that kind of guy, right? Like he didn't give two hoots. And then if anything, one time I even said to him, I was like, Dad, how come, when this is my teenage self-hating self, I said to my dad, I was like, Dad, why did you let me go into figure skating and dance when I was young? And my dad said, well, you wanted to skate, you wanted to dance, so you skated and danced. I was like, huh, okay. And from that, there was no question after that. That was just Keith, right? So I think that for me, although I didn't have parents who were, sending a lot of really negative messaging, my mom in a different way, but not as common. It was just sort of like these offhand comments about queers and the Pride Parade in Toronto, this kind of stuff. But by and large, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. Now, being the youngest of five, and here I have on the back of my phone, here are the Wilsons circa 1993. I had three older brothers and an older sister. My older sister loved that I loved to play with her. My three older brothers didn't think it was that cool that I was playing with doll houses, that I was doing whatever, right? And so I think that for me, that they said a lot of things. They did a lot of things that would fall under the umbrella of conversion practices. Again, I'm not here to what's the word, wag my finger at my brothers. They were young and naive. However, that messaging that they offered, like the messaging, I heard in, the wider culture, like the messaging I heard at school, like the messaging, a lot of us young queer folks hear, these are different messages that accumulate over time and in their own right are conversion practices, right? When a young person or when someone says to anyone, whether they be young or old, don't walk like that, you look like a sissy. Don't, play with that toy. That's a toy only for boys. Whatever it might be, these messages and also actions, depending on the circumstances, these again constitute what we refer to as conversion practices. They're trying to convert someone to become the norm. They're trying to align that person with the sort of stereotypical understanding of masculinity and femininity, which of course very much operates on a binary. And so conversion practices, this was something I think that was quite, surprising for me, was that although not everyone went through conversion therapy, I would say that every queer person has undergone conversion practices. And to expand it even one step further, and I'm not the kind of person who wants to expand boundaries and definitions so everyone feels included. That's not my goal. What I do think, though, is that for straight people who don't align with the stereotypical gender expectations that are for young boys, young girls, men, women, these folks also, I think we can argue that these folks have undergone conversion practices as well, right? For a young boy who's painting his nails and he's straight, he likes women, blah blah blah, who cares? But he's painting his nails. People might say, "Don't do that. You look like an F word." Right? Don't, young girl, you shouldn't be wearing, overalls and have a mullet, even though I think that's a very cool look, Jules. Right? These are things that I think, these also constitute conversion practices. You're trying to get people to align to the heteronormative model, which, a lot of people don't fit that model. And so I think this is the violence of conversion therapy. This is the violence more broadly of conversion practices. And this is really, I think, the most surprising thing for me was realizing that so much of our world really is a series of conversion practices to push us to be a certain way that a lot of us simply just aren't, whether we're gay, straight, bisexual, trans, and beyond, right? I think this is something that was perhaps the biggest surprise when putting the collection together, specifically the introduction.
Thank you. I want to dive a little bit into some of the contents of the book. And again, I know many of you in this room maybe don't have your copy yet, and that's okay, you will get one. But one of the big things that's highlighted throughout the book in the writing is the persistence of conversion practices, what we were just talking about, even in places where they're legally banned, like Canada, different places around the world. I'm curious if you can elaborate a little bit on how these continue to exist underground and how the challenges present themselves to victims and advocates against this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so if we're thinking about the ex-gay movement, this was a movement that really was born in the 1970s in Southern California with a few ex-gay groups that formed eventually what became known as Exodus, later Exodus International, which was the largest conversion, ministry, quote unquote, in the world. And this movement in the 70s was very much a theological sort of enterprise. They said that people can change through the transformative power of Jesus and the salvific power of Jesus' blood on the cross. This is how people believed that folks could change their genders and their sexualities if they did not align, again, with the godly heteronormative model. By the 80s, we find that a lot of these ministries really link up with a number of Christian psychologists and Christian researchers. I put these two terms in quotation marks because researcher and psychologist are very generous terms to describe these people. They were using a lot of crackpot theories about human sexuality, very much this weird interpretation of Freud that laid the groundwork, the theoretical groundwork for conversion therapy as a series of practices, again, mostly happening within Christian contexts. So what happened was these folks who were these Christian ministries in the 70s, again, largely coming out of California, the US, also Australia, up to Canada and beyond, these ministries latched on to these researchers and psychologists because they offered them credibility, right? They said, well, look, here's research being produced about, the efficacy of conversion practices. This is, one more reason why we should be doing this and, justification for how this works. Of course, it never worked, but this was the narrative that they were running with. Now, these researchers and psychologists, they latched onto the Christian ministries. Why? Money. These ministries were paying them, right? They were paying them to come speak at different conferences at their churches. They were buying their books, their tapes, this kind of stuff, right? So they formed this symbiotic relationship, which snowballed from the 80s into the 90s. And this was really the height of the ex-gay movement. What we found with the ex-gay movement by the late 90s is that a number of the leaders were found to be the frauds that they are, right? They were discovered at gay bars. They were discovered in meth-fueled orgies in motel rooms, and there were multiple instances of both, and amongst other sort of really embarrassing, compromising positions, to put it in a certain register. And so, with that being said, a lot of the folks, it was realized, again, people realized that this just simply wasn't working. And so I think that once we then fast forward, to 2013, this is when Exodus, again, the world's largest conversion ministry, closes. From there, a number of splinter organizations formed, right? And so these organizations continue to do the work that they've been doing for years, but they call it a different name. To rewind and then again fast forward back to and up to the present day, in the 90s, the late 90s especially, they were advertising conversion therapy not just for religious communities and people in their churches or in their ministries or whatever. They were advertising this to the general public, right? Like they were on the cover of Time magazine. They were, pulling out billboards in, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and advertising that people can change their genders or sexualities. And so this was very much not just, targeting folks within these religious communities. This was going for the general public. This was going for everyone because they really wanted this to be a movement and not just a religious, sort of practice. And so again, once we saw a number of these leaders fall off and, found out for who they are, they pulled inwards. they stopped advertising outwardly. They stopped, going for the general public. Instead, they started doing a lot of things underground. Now, this was also happening at a time of rapid social change when it comes to gender and sexual minorities, right? In Canada, gay marriage, 2005 was legalized. In the US, 2015, right? So these are two times that, pushes against homophobia were being codified in law. And of course, when that happens, oftentimes, the sort of social perception of these things changes a wee bit and, starts becoming they start aligning in some senses. Of course, homophobia and transphobia didn't die. We know that. However, there was some change that was happening. Now, today, we think about in Canada a few years ago, of course, the national ban. This is a ban that is quite comprehensive in the sense that it doesn't just protect children or minors from conversion practices. This actually covers everyone. However, what we find is that, again, we know that conversion therapy is still happening. It's just happening behind closed doors. Because again, I think with these organizations no longer advertising outwardly, with a lot of these leaders, being found out for who they are, with, research accumulating over time, again, just over and over, underlining that conversion therapy does not work. And if anything, it's damaging and harmful. Conversion therapists, conversion practitioners more broadly understand, again, it's bad PR to be promoting this in public. So what they've done is they've really gone behind closed doors. It was happening behind closed doors before, to be sure, but it was also, again, a very public thing. Now it really is something that's behind closed doors with a few exceptions. One exception is coming out of Redding, California. Bethel Ministries, if anyone's heard of them, Jesus Culture, Kim Walker, these folks, they are still promoting conversion therapy in a very outward way, although they say it's not conversion therapy. It's like, you can call it whatever you want, but it definitionally aligns with conversion practices, right? And so they have formed what's called the Changed movement. And so the Changed movement, really, if you look them up on any social media, particularly Instagram, that's where they're most active. They peddle a lot of really crazy lies and success stories and moments of victory over sexual perversion and gender deviance, whatever they want to call it. And so all this to say is that with that exception and maybe a few others, really a lot of conversion practices have gone underground. Now, if we're talking about in Canada or in the States where there are certain states where it is illegal, mostly for minors and only minors. What happens is that, again, conversion therapies hasn't gone away. It's just gone underground. It's gone on, it's masked itself with a different name. Like all crime, just because something's illegal doesn't mean it's not going to happen, right? In the same way that, there are certain drugs that are criminalized or illegal in Canada, which I don't think they should be, but putting that aside, that there's that regardless of the laws surrounding them, people are still doing these drugs, right? In the same way, although should I say in a certain way, for conversion practices, even though they're illegal, doesn't mean they're not happening. There have been folks out in Alberta who have called, bylaw officers to enforce the Canadian ban, the law, and bylaw officers simply don't. What they've said to the folks out there in a sister organization to Affirm United, when Pam Rocker, who was again this phenomenal activist out in Alberta, when she called and said, "Hey, they're essentially promoting conversion therapy, and in Canada you can't even promote it, not just practice it, you can't promote it." The bylaw officer said, "But they're not calling it conversion therapy." And Pam said, "Of course they're not. You still need to do something." And they said, "But they're not calling it. They didn't say it's conversion therapy." And again, it's like if you have a brain in your head and a heart in your chest, you know that what you should do. But of course, we can't expect too much from some of these folks. And so as a result, these are still practices that happen. These are still messages that are being promoted. And so I think what we find is that regardless of something being illegal, it's still going to happen. It's just going to happen underground and be called, something different, even though, again, definitionally, it is conversion therapy.
Absolutely. And just a personal anecdote, there's even in Toronto, I've had a few trans friends that have been referred to psychiatrists, psychologists that are essentially trying to, convince them of gender normalcy. I'm going to put that in quotations here, and things like that. And, Yeah, a lot of these professionals, yeah, don't label it as conversion therapy, right? They label it as psychological assistance, they label it as healing, they label it as, whatever they feel the label is. Um, and it's, it poses a huge challenge to people who are trying to find themselves. I've had friends who are trying to start hormones, for example, or trying to navigate what gender affirming healthcare looks like, and then they get sent to a psychiatrist that tries to tell them that, they're a wackadoodle. Um, I'm curious in your experience of all of this, Lucas, what kind of challenges this presents for people that have lived through conversion practices and how, we as community members and advocates can keep our eyes open.
Yeah. So in Canada, there's yet to be one challenge to conversion therapy since the law has been passed. Literally, no person or organization has brought forth any charge or claim against any organization or practitioner. I think in part this is because a lot of folks are nervous to set a bad legal precedent and not really know exactly how to, challenge these organizations, these individuals who are practicing conversion therapy. As a result, again, no one has done anything since the ban. So the ban, in large part, has been very symbolic, right? It's saying, hey, we're against these things. This is, as a country, this is not what we stand for. However, in practice, putting theory aside, and sort of the symbolism aside, nothing's been done. And that, I think, is a huge issue. Even, Jules, you were talking about in Toronto, and there are different practitioners that you've heard about, or different practices within medical or psychiatric contexts that have aligned with conversion practices. There was a ministry, I looked them up, at this point I think it was about a year and a half ago, right near my house. I lived in Cabbagetown, and right around the corner, there was a Catholic church that was practicing conversion therapy, again, calling it, pastoral counseling for gender and sexual confusion, or whatever they said at the time. But again, it's practicing conversion therapy. So I think that is a challenge right now in the Canadian context. I think in the US, obviously, there's the Supreme Court case that's happening right now, coming out of the state of Colorado. There's a licensed practitioner who says that in the name of free speech, she should be able to practice conversion therapy. And of course, we all know that every single profession, whether you're a medical doctor, an engineer, a counselor, like her, apparently, that you have a certain code of conduct. And that code of conduct, of course, does not allow you to say whatever the heck you want when you're on the clock. You can say whatever you want on social media, in your personal time, whatever. But if you're on the clock, no, you have a certain decorum that you have to, abide by. And so I think that with that being said, we're seeing, the consequences of, really well, I think we're seeing a lot of challenges to conversion practices, or to laws that are protecting individuals from conversion therapy. I think with that, though, what we can do, right, unless we are to bring forth the case, which I think we should be vigilant in our communities, wherever we are across the country, that we are monitoring, different organizations. If you think that this might be happening, look into it, check it out, and then talk to folks, again, who are either academics, activists, or law enforcement, bylaw officers who can enforce this, or can and should enforce this. But again, that's expecting a lot, apparently. Putting that aside, I think that what we really need to be doing, in addition to this, is again, raising awareness, right? So if you do think that this is happening, I mean, I have a lot of investigative journalist friends who would love these stories. And I plan every time that this happens. I had a friend reach out, and there was a camp that she was a part of for a long time. And then when she came out as queer, they've, excommunicated her immediately. But she knows that there's conversion therapy happening at this camp. So I put her in contact with a journalist. Right. And so as much awareness as we can generate, I think, is important. I think, again, for anyone who is a lawyer, this is something that I think, should be handled in the courts. But I think on top of that, if in fact we're not able to do some of these things that, again, not everyone's able to do, what we can do is support those who have undergone conversion therapy. And the number one way that conversion therapy survivors cite as a generative or a life-giving way that people have interacted with them, specifically in response to their conversion practices, is listening. and hearing them, and again, we talked about listening last time we chatted, and the importance of listening, but when we're talking about conversion therapy, what's a re-traumatizing process for a lot of survivors is when people don't believe them, right? That their experience, their lived reality is negated by way of a conversation, and someone says, that doesn't sound like that happened, or that sounds too extreme or whatever, or sometimes even statements like that doesn't sound so bad, which is kind of a wild thing to say to anyone.
Could have been worse.
But yeah, it could have been worse, and I
Yeah.
think that this is sort of this is certainly something that, again, this is actually Canadian research that backs this up, is having a supportive community, and they don't actually even have to be
Mhm.
queer. They can be literally anyone and everyone, but to have a supportive community. The second most cited way of again, working through the trauma of conversion therapy that survivors mention is having a queer group of friends or a queer support system. So first is literally having anyone and everyone. And I think oftentimes what people mean by that is like their families.
Yeah.
Second to that is having a queer community who's there to support. So I think if we're able to raise awareness, if that means connecting with a journalist, or if we're thinking about taking legal action, or if we're talking about writing about experiences that people have had in conversion therapy wherever they've had them, and then placing these articles or these representations in different media outlets. These are all really, really wonderful ways to resist conversion practices happening in our own backyards. But then on top of all of that is really to support survivors and to work with them and provide a listening ear.
Mhm. Thank you. I love to always hear about now what, right? Now we're reading the book, now we're having this conversation. What do we do? One last question for me before we open up some Q&A time is throughout this whole process that you've been on of collecting stories and hearing from folks and uh, you know, going through all these experiences, what has been the most soul-filling or life-giving, I guess, part of all of this for you?
I would say the response the responses that I've gotten largely in my DMs and my direct messages on social media, people just, they've read the book and they reach out and just say thanks. There was one person recently, and he was talking about how for him, he went through conversion therapy for a number of years. And he, beyond that, he was a part of very conservative evangelical tradition for, many years before that and up until recently. He's since left, but he said that, he's like, I cannot shake the shame. I cannot get over,
Mhm.
associating my sexuality with something that's bad, that's dirty, that's defective, that in some cases, it's labeled as demonic. Because again, this messaging accumulates over time, and it really is hard to untether ourselves from this and to liberate ourselves from this way of thinking. And so, nonetheless, just hear this person who was, he said some nice things about the book. And I think for me is hearing people say, like, I saw myself in that story. I read
Mm.
myself in that story. I feel represented. I feel seen. That to me is huge. I that's of course the goal of the book. The goal was to give voice to a range of experiences, and although not everyone's story is the same, our stories rhyme. And
Yeah.
so, when we're able to hear ourselves in the rhyme, I think that's powerful. And so for me, the most life-giving aspect or sort of result or fruit of this book has been hearing from other survivors, and again, folks who were a part of conservative religious traditions more broadly, and hearing how they, although they didn't go through conversion therapy, they experienced conversion practices,
Mhm.
and so see themselves in the book.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.